This move, e4, immediately claims central space and opens diagonals for both the queen and king's bishop, setting the stage for dynamic pawn play and rapid development. This move, 1, e6, prepares to challenge white's central pawn and opens a diagonal for the queen and king's bishop, establishing the foundation for a solid French defense. This move stakes a claim in the center and prepares to develop pieces, setting up the theoretical French defense which aims for a solid pawn structure for black and active piece play for white. This move establishes the French defense, a solid opening where black immediately challenges white's central pawn push and aims for a symmetrical pawn structure to begin the strategic battle. This move, nc3, develops a piece towards the center, maintaining the pressure on black's d5 pawn and preparing to challenge for central control, a hallmark of solid opening play. This move, 3, dxe4, concedes the center and often leads to positions where white enjoys a slight space advantage, a common characteristic of the advanced French defense after white plays nc3. This recapture maintains white's central pawn presence and develops a piece actively, leading to the main lines of the generally accepted classical defense. This move develops a piece and attacks white's knight, initiating a common response within the French defense, aiming to regain central pawn presence. This move initiates an exchange, simplifying the position and preventing black from castling by removing the knight that protects the king's defense. This pawn capture on f6 strengthens black's kingside pawn structure and opens the g-file for potential queen or rook activity, but it also creates doubled pawns and weakens the king's position. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting a potential kingside pawn advance and preparing to castle. This move aims to develop the queenside bishop to a more active diagonal, but it weakens the dark squares and creates potential targets on the queenside. Developing the bishop to e2 supports the kingside pawn structure and prepares for castling, aiming to connect the rooks and centralize the king. Developing the bishop to b7 aims to control the long, open diagonal and potentially pressure white's queenside, while also supporting the pawn structure after white's aggressive pawn play. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to pressure the queenside and potentially support a kingside pawn advance later. This move, 8, qc8, looks to connect the rooks by castling kingside and potentially prepare a kingside pawn advance with f5 later, though it also obstructs the c-file development for the queen. Developing the knight to the kingside here aims to connect the rooks and prepare for kingside castling, but it also delays supporting the central pawn structure and potentially opens lines for black's bishop on b7. This move prepares to develop the knight to a more active central square and supports the central pawn structure. Castling kingside secures the king and connects the rooks, a fundamental developmental goal now that most of white's pieces are in play. This move challenges white's central pawn and opens a diagonal for black's light-squared bishop, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain active piece play. This move repositions the rook to an active file, supporting the central pawn push and preparing for potential kingside action by maintaining kingside defense. The queen retreats to c7, preparing to support a queenside pawn advance and potentially link up with the rook on the c-file. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to exert pressure along the h2b8 diagonal and potentially support a kingside pawn advance, or prepare for further piece development. The queen is returned to the c8 square to prepare for potential cxd4 and to provide a safe haven from the attacking bishop on f4. while also allowing the rook on a8 to potentially enter the game via the c8h3 diagonal. This move strategically supports the d4 pawn and prepares to solidify the pawn center, potentially allowing for further queenside expansion or central pawn pushes in the future. This developing move prepares to unpin the knight and allows the bishop to participate in defending the kingside, while also clearing the g7 square for future king safety maneuvers. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to control the crucial d6h2 diagonal and potentially support a queenside expansion or prepare for further central action. By advancing the c-pawn to c4, Black aims to restrict White's queenside development and potentially create weaknesses on White's d4 square while gaining space on the queenside. This knight maneuver aims to improve piece activity by rerouting to more central squares, potentially supporting a queenside expansion or contesting key central diagonals. This move repositions the bishop to defend the e7 pawn from the attack of White's knight on f4 and also prepares to challenge White's strong bishop on d6. This move exchanges White's active bishop for Black's generally passive one, aiming to simplify the position and potentially exploit Black's weakened kingside pawn structure. After the early gx-f6, the king's recapture on f8 activates it from its vulnerable starting position and prepares for potential pawn pushes in the center, though it now occupies a less secure square and potentially obstructs the rooks. This move exchanges White's potentially weak bishop for Black's well-placed, though perhaps passive, bishop, simplifying the position while opening the a-file for White's rook. Capturing the bishop on b7 regains material and opens the a-file for your queen, but it weakens your pawn structure and grants Black improved central control. This move shifts the queen to a more active central square, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure and potentially target the g7 pawn. The move (18) Road 8 is a practical choice, developing the rook to an open file and preparing to contest it with White's own rook, while also connecting the rooks for future coordination. This move initiates a decisive attack on the exposed Black king, forcing tactical exchanges and creating mating threats due to the open g-file and the discovered check from the bishop. The king is forced into a more active, yet vulnerable, central position, abandoning the safety of the castled king's flank, which significantly weakens White's attack. The immediate recapture of the bishop with qg7, while seemingly aggressive and targeting the weakened kingside, overlooks a critical tactical sequence that will lead to material loss for White. This pawn advance seizes central space, opening lines for White's pieces and potentially creating weaknesses in Black's pawn structure. This capture opens the d-file and creates a tactical opportunity to exploit the undefended Black king, while also opening lines for White's bishops. This move opens up the e-file for White's rook and creates an isolated pawn on e5 for Black, which may become a long-term target. This move establishes a strong central presence on the d-file, preparing to attack White's weakened kingside and exploit the open lines that have resulted from Black's pawn advances. Black's qb8 aims to reposition the queen to a more active square, potentially eyeing the queenside or supporting a central pawn push, while also connecting the rooks and preparing for future activity. This strong knight sacrifice opens lines for White's pieces, forcing Black's king into a precarious central position and creating opportunities for a decisive mating attack. The move 23, k6 is a necessary repositioning of the king to escape the knight's check and centralize it, though it enters a precarious position with open lines and potential for further tactical threats. This aggressive queen sacrifice is designed to expose black's king by deflecting the protecting bishop and opening lines for the white queen. This move is a desperate attempt to counter white's king attack by opening lines for counterplay and creating a passed pawn. But it weakens the kingside considerably. The move 25, Qg7 repositions the queen aggressively to a strong attacking square, threatening the g6 pawn and preparing to exploit the weakened kingside after black's pawn advances.